author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
This week, it's all about messaging and the message. We'll be covering the electric vehicle boondoggle, why the Biden-Harris administration seems to be stuck with a failure to communicate, and what messages the GOP sending with its efforts to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas. You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's show, we'll be discussing all the aforementioned topics and a lot more. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. As the cold weather came, it seems that the much-vaunted electric vehicles were not up to the task. Now, what does this bode for an industry that seems to be on its last coal-fueled legs? Well, we have with us today author, farmer, pastor, and national correspondent for LibertyNation.com, Mr. John Klahr. John, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So, John, you've written extensively on the pages of LibertyNation.com, and I do recommend everybody goes there and reads John's fantastic takedowns of what's happening. It's a real, there's a great article he's got out called Who Killed the Electric Vehicle, Who Done It With a Twist, which is fantastic. It's so much fun to read. But, John, we've seen the recent weeks, recent days even, we've had cold snaps that are literally stopping electric vehicles in their tracks. What's going on?
Well, I think a couple of things are going on. One is people are becoming aware of the rather severe and probably insurmountable problems with batteries in cold weather. But the other is this really may be, I think, and I didn't mention this in the article, but this really could be the straw on the camel's back for EV cars, because there's a growing sense that something is wrong and smells in Denmark. And now we find out it freezes too, right in the roadway. This is a serious problem, and a lot of consumers are not going to want this. And I think it's starting a vicious cycle of in prices, and then people don't want to buy a car that's going to lose 30% of its value. And so despite all of the incentives and all the big talk and all the high advertising, it's turning out to not deliver anything like the grand technological promises of utopian travel that were offered to people. And so now I think it's unraveling and fast.
I think you're probably right there, John. So, and the idea that it's this utopian ideal that we'll all be driving electric and the planet will be saved, and it really is. It's a utopian fantasy, isn't it? I mean, it's no coincidence that the word utopia literally means nowhere, right? It's not actually a thing. So let's talk about the batteries that you mentioned there. During the recent cold weather snaps that we saw across not just the United States, but pretty much all over the world, because, you know, we call it, I can't remember what it used to be called before climate change, but it begins with a W, winter. That's the one, winter. Now, what happens to the batteries on these electric vehicles during colder temperatures?
Well, scientifically, science has a way of intruding on utopian fantasies. And scientifically, all batteries slow down. The transfer of ions, I'm not a physics guy, but I did study it. It slows way, way down to the point of actually these vehicles lose about 40% of their energy if their heater is on, particularly. And I've actually asked this for years. I live in a very cold place here in Vermont. Doesn't that mean I have to heat my car as well with an electric battery? Because that could be a real challenge here. And so it slows everything down. It also apparently really adversely impacted the charging stations, Mark. So a normal charging time is an hour or more. People were giving up on charging their vehicles. Some people reported having spent hours ineffectively, literally they won't charge. And if the battery is cold, for the same scientific reasons, it tremendously slows down the rate of charge. So a lot of the initial energy has to go in preheating the battery in order to then charge it. And so if you start compounding all these delays, and especially that's why you see Hertz dropped tens of thousands of vehicles that it bought is its EV fleet, because if you're going on a long trip and you have to stop for 2 or 3 hours every 200 miles, what they call range anxiety, people would like to have convenience as well as climate saving. And I think this raises the broader issue of something Orwell said, and you're hinting at it, that if people really thought about what these utopian ideas were, for instance, opening all borders to solve all the world's problems, he specifically spoke to that. He said if they understand what it would cause, they wouldn't be clamoring for such things. And I think there's a parallel here with the EV cars. They're not delivering and people don't want them.
Yeah, it seems very much one-step thinking that cars are a big polluter, therefore if we go to electric cars, there won't be pollution, which is, of course, it's a nonsense, right? Because as you have discussed in your extensive coverage on the page of libertynation.com, quick plug there, these batteries that they're using, now granted, let's be fair to the industry, battery technology will improve, although I wonder how much capacity room for improvement there is on this type of batteries that they're looking at the moment, or that they're using at the moment. But the actual batteries themselves are not exactly what you'd call ecologically friendly, right?
Well, you actually raise a number of issues. That's why I say this is sort of a cascading effect, because people are now a little less and less enamored all the time with these promised salvific technologies, because the cold problem follows a growing realization by a lot of people that lithium needs to be mined and batteries need to be disposed of. And you're quite right that even if we do develop technological advances, they are still going to face those problems. Limited resources that generate pollution other than, in addition to CO2 in their mining and manufacturing, and then, well, they don't dispose well. And there don't seem to be, these don't seem to be technologically surmountable problems. And when you start adding that, so now they don't even save the climate, you're quite right. And so I think that's why they're starting to leave a bad taste in people's mouth, especially with high price tags. And as we may discuss more, the regressive nature of how they're funded. And then the big thing is people like convenience, kind of like what Orwell was suggesting. Yeah, I want to help the whole world, but I don't want to give up anything. So it's all nice to ask people to buy an expensive car to save the planet until it doesn't seem to be doing so, and it's really inconvenient and unreliable. People don't want their loved ones stranded on the side of the road in a winter storm.
Well, you know, I'm old enough to remember 2 years ago. I know I don't look that I'm old enough to remember 2 years ago, but I am. When cars were stranded along highways in snowstorms, I think that was 2 years ago, it might have been three, in the United States. And what basically people did was they sat there in their cars for up to 12 hours or so, or even longer in some cases, with the heater on. You know, engine running, ticking over nicely with the fuel. Sure, it uses some power there, but that's how cars are built. That your engine can keep going for quite a long time. But they sat there and they were there heated because of their car. Now that's just something that is not presently physically possible with an electric vehicle, is it?
Well, I believe it is, but it's probably going to run out of energy sooner.
Yes. Sorry, that was my meaning. It's not possible to for such a long period of time, like 12 hours or 14 hours.
Yeah, because the cold and the heaters also reduce the efficiency of gas-powered vehicles as well, but not as much. Yes. And apparently with EVs, the batteries start to lose their efficiency once they drop below 68 degrees, according to what I studied. The optimal range is 68 to 86 degrees, which is a very nice California temperature. So they've sold a lot of these vehicles and put in a lot of charging stations in a warm climate. And now they're finding, gee, it was supposed to be for the whole world. I guess they're not going to do well in Alaska. You sure want to hesitate to buy one in Alaska. But now when you're getting bombarded with cold down south, you know, maybe a lot of people are going to hesitate. And then if you study that it actually, they go through tires 30% faster than regular cars. I haven't quite figured out why that is. Then, yeah, if you get stranded in a snowstorm, you can stay warmer longer, but also somebody could bring you 5 gallons of gas. You know, and so, by the way, they responded to this by saying future models of the cars will be equipped with chargers so they can rescue one another. And there are some augmentations. Tesla, in particular, has these to extend travel or improve charging rates, but they're still far from solving these problems. But at least we're not in England, where you get stranded in your car if there's like half an inch of snow. And it doesn't matter whether it's an EV or a gas. If
there's a heavy rain, the roads flood in the UK, and for some reason, after centuries of having roads, thousands of years even, we still have yet to combat this. Anyway, it seems, John, that there's some technological issues which suggest that there's the push by government to encourage everybody with the electric vehicles, it is a premature push at best. Now, we'll get back to discussing the government, the federal escapades regarding electric vehicles after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with farmer, attorney, pastor, national correspondent, LibertyNation.com, a man, all things to all people, Mr. John Clark. Now, earlier in the show, we were talking with John about the technological issues and weather-related issues doing with electric vehicles. But now, John, I'd like to discuss more the federal promotion of electric vehicles. Now, this seems to be, and this is not just in the United States, this is worldwide in Western governments, where the push to get everybody away from gas vehicles, petrol-powered vehicles, to electric vehicles is running apace. But the infrastructure is not there, is it?
It's not, and that's also what's being revealed here. And as I studied for the piece, I realized that there is a very uneven pattern of existing charging stations around the country. In fact, Hertz Rentals suggests that you be very careful before you rent a car to make sure you plot your trip and make sure there will be sufficient charging facilities.
Sorry, John, if I may interrupt you very briefly, because you did mention Hertz rental cars in the first segment, and you just brought them up again now. The news there is that after going on a push to get a big range of electric vehicles within their fleet for rental presumably, they're actually selling those off because of the infrastructure problems, essentially, because, as you point out, it was range anxiety, I believe you called it. And this is a problem that Hertz has acknowledged, that people really can't do that cross-country trip unless they're planning for extended stopovers with charging facilities.
I'm not sure that Hertz actually acknowledged the problem other than to say they're selling about 20,000 cars, I'm sure, at a loss.
Actions speak louder than words, John.
Yes. And so I may be filling in. I just want to be clear, what I attribute to Hertz versus my own insights. But if you think about it, this is how in the article I compared that the things that are impacting consumers in the rental market extend to private ownership as well. But particularly you see it heightened because usually often when we rent a car, it is for a long trip. It's because my car may never make it back again, or if I get a breakdown in Kentucky, that could be a real problem waiting for the shop to fix my transmission. So often people will use a car for long distance travel when they're renting. And those are trips that are particularly ill-suited for EV cars. So I think that's why, despite all the grand visions and the push, and a lot of people, when it comes to what they actually want to drive in and feel secure in and feel convenient in, and if you're on a long trip and you have to stop twice for an hour and a half just to fill up or to get energy again, that could actually mean you don't reach your destination in time. You have to stay over in a hotel. I don't know how good that is for the planet, but it's just not convenient. And these are serious problems that maybe they will solve, but when added to all of the others and the high cost, it's a harder and harder sell. Despite all of the free marketing and extremely high funding by our government with our tax dollars.
I love that you use the term free marketing by the federal government with taxpayer dollars. I think that's a wonderful, I'm going to have that put on a pillow, stitched onto a pillow for me. Free marketing by the federal government with federal dollars. I love it. But the point you raise is really fantastic. One is that you've got all these dollars going in to try and pick winners and losers in the market, right? And that's taxpayer dollars being used by the federal government to pick a winner and a loser. But there's also the subsidies as well that are being given out to purchases of electric vehicles. But tell me, what are the details on that? And does it pass the sniff test, I guess I'm asking?
No, it doesn't. And I think it's a really important issue. And I'm glad you're raising it. And yes, they are our tax dollars. It's a lot of money. One study recently estimated that the true cost of an EV car was the equivalent of $17.33 a gallon of gas. This was out of Texas. But it's actually something I've been writing about for years, which is unique to the EV cars and the solar panels. In both cases, those who call themselves progressives are implementing extraordinarily regressive tax structures. And this is something very obvious to me. For your listeners, my background, I was a tax attorney for several years, including in the UK, in Birmingham. And one of the things I studied in tax policy in law school was the idea of regressive versus progressive taxation. And I assume, and you may assume, a lot of people assume everybody understands what this is, but regressive taxes are taxes that disproportionately impact the poor. And sales taxes are a good example. A poll tax is a good example. If I pay $50 a year as a poll tax and I only make $10,000 a year, that's a much higher percentage of my income than if I'm Mark Zuckerberg. What is the dirty secret of both EV cars and solar panels is that they have been funded rather surreptitiously on the backs of poor Americans who could never afford such a car. Yeah. And I really think that progressives, they just go quiet. In fact, I've pressed them on this, and they will argue that it's okay because who are we trying to help in the world? Poor people. Who is going to suffer the most from climate change that we're rescuing them from? Oh, it's the poor people. So they literally, as progressive, justify extraordinarily regressive tax structures. And what we're getting at here is that even with all of that money, EV cars are still failing. This is just a grotesque business failure, and it makes one recall that definition of fascism, which is when government and corporations collude. It is not driven by market factors, and this is what we see. It reminds me more of a banana republic or a Soviet or Chinese effort to have a 5-year plan for your new cars and your tuna fish and everything else that we will allocate for you. Yeah. It's a terrible failure, but it's also they should answer to the American people with all of these plans about who's paying for it. These elites, right out of Milton Friedman, socialism is A, telling B how much he's going to pay C. And if more Americans understood that they were paying for other people to drive these very expensive, very inefficient, ultimately planet-destroying vehicles for the short-term profits of a few stakeholders, I think there would be a little bit more of a pushback.
Yeah, it's not an aspect of the EV revolution that, just for example, the Biden administration really talks about. They talk about how it's saving the planet. They don't talk about how, sure, maybe it is. I think the jury's still out on this, although I can guess which way it's going. But it's not saving you, and it's not saving your children. It's impoverishing. It's literally impoverishing a generation of people, so that, as you point out, people who can afford electric cars get a minor tax break, a $7,000 tax break on buying an EV car that they can feel better about, whilst people are losing services from their communities because the tax dollars are being spent to essentially give a freebie to somebody who can afford it anyway.
But there's another big lie here that I think we should bring to the table, which is that EV car sales are going to help the economy. Solar panel technology installations are going to help the economy, and that we're going to reduce inflation by spending trillions of dollars on these things, by buying products from China. That's how we help our economy. Once upon a time in economics, you produced and sold goods to foreign entities to actually bring income into your country. That was called economic growth. But apparently now, if I'm in Vermont and I get paid to install a Chinese solar panel, I'm boosting the economy and fighting inflation. The opposite is true in both. It's a short-term blip for the economy, for a service economy, for installation. We might as well say that installing a hot tub in every home in America is going to resolve inflation and boost the economy. It will help hot tub sales for a little bit.
John Clark, thank you ever so much for joining us on this special edition of Liberty Nation Radio. Much appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
As the 2024 election looms closer and closer, the message coming out of the White House is that, yes, things are going great. You just don't realize it. Now we've got an interesting conundrum to unravel there, and to help us do that, we're going to be joined by Liberty Nation's chief political correspondent and satirist, Mr. Graham J. Noble. Thanks for being here, Graham.
Pleasure to be here, Mark.
So, Graham, this is not just a one-off message that the ungrateful populace, the ignorant populace, is not just realizing all the good that the Biden administration's doing. This is this is the core message going into 2024, other than, of course, Trump's a dangerous dictator.
Yeah.
What do you make?
Well, yeah, it's their messaging is actually kind of all over the place, really, when it comes to the economy, Mark, because one moment the Biden administration is saying, well, it's not really our fault. For instance, inflation is about corporations raising their prices and they're going to have to bring them down. But then on the other hand, they're saying, Bidenomics and we've got such a strong economy. So, kind of which is it? It's the fact that the economy is not good is one thing, but their messaging on the economy is just so all over the map that they need to get a grip on that as we get closer to the general election.
I'm reminded of the line from Cool Hand Luke, the Paul Newman movie. What we have here is a failure to communicate. Now, you wrote a very, very fun article in your role as chief satirist over at LibertyNation.com that examined Kamala Harris's recent attempt, I guess you'd call it, to explain the benefits of the Biden-Harris ticket. And it was Katie Couric, who herself is she's a respectable journalist. She runs Katie Couric Media, which is a pretty big deal. But she set up this softball question talking about, obviously, you've done all these great things, words to that effect. It was giving Kamala Harris an opportunity to just hit it out of the park. Now, Graham, I've written this down because I think it's a wonderful example of the communication issues that are facing the White House, courtesy of the number 2 boss lady. So she says, quote, "Historic work has happened, no question. It is incumbent on us to let people know who brung it to them, frankly. So you're right, we have a lot of accomplishments. And I think what the American people want most in their leaders is that we actually get things done. And we have done it. We haven't taken adequate credit for it, frankly. And we've got to do a better job of getting the word out about what we have accomplished and who did it." Now, end quote, by the way. This is me speaking now. That wasn't me speaking before. So, Graham, what we have accomplished and who did it. Let's start with that first. And if you wouldn't mind, explain to me what the hell that means.
Well, Kamala Harris has this problem, and I'm sure there's some kind of like medical term for it. But she has a condition in which when she's making any kind of speech or responding to a question, her mouth fills up with lots of words. And they're kind of all jumbled up. It's like her mouth is a tumble dryer of words, and then when she opens her mouth, those words just kind of spill out. And often there are way too many of them, and they're in no particular order. And so we have this.
Jump in there, Graham. You just remind me of 2 fantastic points. One is that she's clearly the yoga bearer of politics, but with less humor. And number 2, our audience may or may not be familiar with an old comedy duo from the UK, but I'm sure you are, Morecambe and Wise.
Oh, yes.
On their show, they had Andre Previn, the famous musician composer.
Yes.
And one of the comedy duo was playing the piano, and he was playing, I think, Tiptoe Through the Tulips, and it was supposed to be a great orchestral piece in line with Andre Previn. And Andre Previn said, you're not playing the right notes. And he grabs him by the lapels and says, "I was playing the right notes, just not necessarily in the right order."
Yeah.
Do hunt that out on YouTube if you can find it, listeners. But yes, it seems that she has the words, but then they just get all jumbled up in her mouth and come out and essentially have no meaning towards the end.
Yeah. I mean, that quote you just did, what was it? I can't remember what it is now. And I quoted it myself in the article, but what we have achieved and who did it or something is like, it just doesn't make any sense. And let's not even get on the subject of the word brung, which of course is not a real word at all.
We brung it. We brung it.
We brung it. Yeah.
we brunged it, I think is the past participle. But let's talk about what that actually, not what the words mean, because there's no deciphering that, but what the message is. Essentially, it seems to me that the Biden-Harris administration, they're saying that we have had tangible effects, positive effects on the economy, on people's day-to-day living, on the country, but that people can't see them. Now, I mean, sure, that could be possible. You know, for example, I'm sure the CIA does wonderful work overseas and we don't get to see it. But what does that mean? What does that really mean electorally? I think if you can't elucidate and explain what you've done for the people in very clear words, they're not going to vote for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, and this is kind of what the Biden White House has been saying recently, and they've been a little upset with the media that and I find this surprising, but they're actually saying that the media is also not being fair about when the media talks about the economy, that they're mentioning, the weaknesses in the economy, which are many and varied. And the Biden administration is saying to the media, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be talking it up. But of course, most of the media is. But I'd like very briefly to quote a article from Politico, and this is an article from the end of last year, November of last year, and I think this is a good example of their issue with the economy. And in this article, it says, the results, and it's talking about the results of a poll on the economy, the results suggest that voters' dim view of the economy is locked in ahead of Election Day on Tuesday. That was underscored by other questions in the poll, blah, blah, blah. But it says voters were more likely to have heard about the country's record high inflation than they were about declining gas prices or recent increases in wages. Now, that in itself is disingenuous because okay, yes, gas prices have come down from record highs, and so for anyone to take credit for declining gas prices is outrageous.
Well, here's the thing: if you take credit for bringing the gas price down, you also have to take credit through your policies. You also have to take credit for pushing the gas price up.
Yeah. Which, of course, they were never willing to do. When gas prices went up, it was the oil companies were gouging us. And when gas prices came down, it wasn't, because it's in the reverse. Okay, when gas prices went up, the oil companies were gouging us, then surely when gas prices came down, the oil companies were, acting, in good faith and reducing the prices. But no. It was the Biden administration that brought gas prices down.
Yeah, it's, I think, with this message that they're trying to push out, that you just don't understand how good you've got it. Yeah. I think if they had some real achievements, and I'm sure there are some there, especially for their voting, for the Democrat voting base, there are going to be some achievements that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris can point to. But the issue there is, while that will be red meat, or we should call it blue meat, for dyed-in-the-wool Democrat voters, it's not necessarily good fodder for the independents, for the growing swath of independents, which are really the main moving force in American politics nowadays. So if their key messaging on their key policies isn't enough to reach out to that middle ground, then perhaps they need to be looking at why they're governing for a minority rather than the majority of Americans. And that might be the most useful aspect. Sorry, I took the last word, but Graham J. Noble, thank you ever so much for joining us today.
No problem, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The House of Representatives sent either a message or a blow to the Biden administration, moving to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Now, at the time of recording, there has not been a floor vote on that as of yet, but there's so much more going on in the world of border crisis in America that we're very fortunate to have with us constitutional attorney, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, and legal affairs editor for LibertyNation.com, Mr. Scott D Cenza. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Cheers, Mark, and witness to the marathon-length hearing that resulted in
Scott donated 800
The
hours of his
impeachment.
life to watching one hearing. I mean, it may not have actually been 800 hours, but I'm sure it felt like it.
It's funny because I usually, my principal work is to cover the courts rather than the Congress. And they're punctual and they don't work, basically past happy hour, as it were. So it's funny
as is typical of those in the legal world.
Right.
Martinis at 5? Yes, please.
At least not publicly in any case, with hearings like the Congress did with the Mayorkas matter.
So yeah, there was this hearing this last week, Scott, and it was about the border crisis, the constitutionality, the constitutional question, I guess.
Yes, the other hearing that took place on the same day as Mayorkas's committee
impeachment markup at a committee, and so they were discussing really that. I guess that the main issue in that hearing was the situation with Texas against the Biden administration. Give us your insight here.
Yeah, the principal focus is whether Greg Abbott's actions are legal or not. And he has declared basically war, that he's engaged in a war and claimed the right to defend Texas from an invasion and basically act pursuant to those war powers that a state has. Now, the other side is that while a state may repel an invasion, that is more classically defined as an armed insurrection by a defined group with a certain goal, and that the drip, 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 or perhaps we can't even say drip, drip, drip anymore, but steady flow of immigrants across the border with the permission of the Biden administration, of our federal government, does not constitute an invasion. So what does an invasion mean, and whether the governor is entitled to use that in action against undocumented immigrants? Those are the questions.
And presumably each two different sides in that hearing argued the case. But how many of them really addressed, before we find out what the arguments they were making was, how many of them actually addressed the question of this is what an invasion is and this is not what an invasion is? Was that prevalent? Because it seems to me that is the key question.
I was pleasantly surprised by a fairly high level of discussion about the issues, with one exception from Gerald Nadler, who was a member of the.
He said these immigrants, they don't exist.
Actually, it was funny. I was
with Antifa.
I was ready for him. I was really, I mentioned to you privately that I enjoyed watching the hearing because I thought there was some valuable back and forth. And what I was expecting from him, an argument as to why it isn't, and he just said it's preposterous and screamed, and then yielded back his time like a Cenk Younger kind of an argument, which I thought. Is that really where we are? That just screaming your position is somehow a relevant point? But there was...
He has form in that area.
There were positions on both sides that were articulated well. And I think the weaker position is that, for instance, this does constitute an invasion. If we think about the plain meaning of the word invasion, at the time the measure was passed, our Constitution, hard to imagine that they would have thought that if... The federal government is slowly letting people come across the border, that somehow constitutes the plain language meaning of the word invasion, and that just seems to me to win the day. And especially when we consider, Mark, the consequences of what it would mean to say that Texas and Texas Governor Abbott have the ability to do this. There was, in fact, one member of the committee, or one of the witnesses, suggested that there was an environmental invasion by Canada in some capacity. And this was a person who was arguing for the notion that the migrants, the illegal aliens, if you will, present an invasion. So, in other words, what could happen is you could reduce the bar for state action against a foreign government or foreign actors to effectively zero. If we can say, well, if they're going to lobster fish in Halifax, then that's an invasion to our environmental whatever. There were those tangential arguments. So it seems to me the stronger argument, the one that has carried the day for most of our history, is that it is the federal government's purview to enforce our international borders, and that absent some extraordinary, I'm thinking of an invasion like the Israelis suffered at the hands of the Hamas terrorists, for instance, rather than a steady stream of pre-announced unarmed people who present themselves to authorities for inspection and then distribution, which let's be clear, that is what we have at the southern border.
Actually, you know what? I don't really want to play the devil's advocate on this one, but it seems to me that a lot of the issues that many Americans have with the apparently open border is that there are people coming across armed, and they aren't coming through regular checkpoints, and they are bringing drugs, trafficked children, firearms, with the intent to commit nefarious deeds on U.S. soil. There was an elderly gentleman who recently ended up going to prison, I believe, for shooting at a group of heavily armed men on his property down in Texas. So where does this really leave Texas then, in terms of what it can and can't do? So let's say, for example, Texas has decided that we don't want all of these people coming into the state. What can they do about it?
Well, they certainly can continue to erect physical barriers like they have with their razor wire fencing to prevent it. Now, the Supreme Court has ruled that the federal government may destroy and remove that fencing to facilitate their own goals as determined by the Biden administration, by Joe Biden or whoever's making decisions in that administration on this issue. But the ruling doesn't prevent Texas from erecting those barriers. It just says that the federal government officials who tear it down aren't liable under any kind of state law theory that they must leave it in place. So they can continue to do that, and they have and are fantastically so, continuing to add, I think, more and more fencing that will be torn down. The other thing that they can do, of course, is on the political side, which is to put pressure on the Biden administration to end the policy. And I think, based on the current law, they can continue to export these people to other states, which is to say, shipping them to New York, to Chicago. Yeah, let them continue to give sanctuary and relieve Texas of the burden. Yeah,
I don't think that the term sanctuary state or sanctuary city is going to survive much longer. I think it's on life support.
It's not selling well in 2024, Mark. One of the things I thought was fascinating to watch during the Mayorkas impeachment hearing was how much the sea has changed. That previously the air was, hey, sure, there's some problems at the southern border, but you're a bunch of racist, bigots if you think it's an issue, and we're handling it, and that's to a kind of total shift to, oh yes, everybody knows that not only is there a problem, but it's past the crisis point, and we absolutely are required as a nation and leaders to do something about it, and immediately. It really is really fascinating just how those winds have changed.
It's almost as if there wasn't an intervening period where people were warning about it.
And no recognition of one's, in terms of, for the people who thought there was nothing to worry about, nothing to worry about.
Given the current political climate, Scott, let's be fair, I believe legal immigration is the number 2 issue for Americans. Do you think that there'll be some Democrats in the House who are willing to side with the Republicans when if it comes to an impeachment vote on Alejandro Mayorkas?
Wow. There is certainly the energy there for them to get on what I would say is the right side of the immigration issue for them, meaning politically the right side is to now be seen as doing something about the border crisis. But to say that Mayorkas deserves to be impeached and willing to go along with it, I think is probably a bridge too far for most.
A bridge too far. A great screenplay by William Goldman. We'll see how it plays out in the movie theater that is American Congress. Scott D Cenza, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. I'd like to thank our guests today, John Clark, Graham J. Noble, and as always, Mr. Scott D Cenza, Esquire, for joining us, and extend my thanks to you also at home for taking the time to tune in and listen every single week. Thanks for being part of the team. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.